Who are you, what did you study, and which jobs have you worked?
Sure, I'm Hamish Todd. What did I study? So originally, I started studying politics and I didn't like that, so I dropped out. And then I went to study mathematics and philosophy. The reason that I studied mathematics and philosophy, it'll sound weird, but I wanted to make video games. I had heard that mathematics would be helpful for that, and I was really interested in philosophy. I wanted to make philosophical kind of video games. And I sort of succeeded in some ways, but anyway, after that I did a master's in computer science, and then after that I did a PhD in molecular biology. And then profession-wise, so I've done a few different things. I used to write about video games a lot as a journalist. I was published on a website called Rock Paper Shotgun. After that, I was a maths teacher, which turned out to be pretty useful for what I do, rather bizarrely. And then after my PhD, I was working for a bit on rice, so trying to improve the yield of rice. And then I went to work at a GPU company, initially Huawei, and then now Imagination Technologies, where I've been for the last couple of years.
And how did all of those things get you into geometric algebra?
So yes, geometric algebra I was interested in partly because of the maths teaching thing, essentially. So I knew that I wanted, this is a couple of years ago, sort of going back about 4 years, I knew that I wanted to make something that would let young people, so maybe 12, maybe even 7-year-olds, or but in any case, young people without much of a background in mathematics, I wanted to make something that would let them make something that they really wanted to make, and break down some of the barriers that, in terms of like technology. And that means making it so that they understand quite complicated things. But in my opinion, we have this wonderful device now called the computer, which allows you to take a very complicated idea and make it visual. And this has not been completely appreciated yet. There's a lot of people doing computer visualization of various things, but there's lots and lots of things that we haven't tried yet, I would say. And geometric algebra is filled with things that you can visualize, and very, very useful, very sophisticated things that you can use to, for example, make a video game, or for example, make an animation, or maybe something more complicated like a scientific diagram. And that's what got me interested in geometric algebra.
So it's sort of synthesized everything you did before into one thing?
Yeah, to a large extent, with the possible exception of the biology. But there is a little biology project that I do want to get to. I don't have very much free time, but yes. The biology, actually, I did for a while work on trying to make it so that a scientist could give a presentation about a molecule that they're working on. So, for example, pharmacologists, for example, they care a lot about, okay, we've got this protein and this drug molecule comes along and it binds with the protein, and then something else quite complicated can happen. For example, another protein comes along and it may or may not interact. And they want to talk about that kind of thing using their hands, and maybe using quite sophisticated, again, visualizations. And again, that's the kind of thing that I had in mind when I went into geometric algebra, to make it so that people would have a kind of visual interface for making complicated pictures.
Why did you decide on going for biology too? Because mathematics and philosophy is already a weird combination, I guess, but I can see where you're going with that. But biology, to add biology to that, is just completely out of it.
So there's two things going on there. One of them was that at the end, it's a relatively obvious thing. So at the end of my undergraduate degree, I took a course that isn't available in most universities, which was on mathematical virology. And I got very, very interested in viruses, and I'm talking about biological viruses, for a long time. I made something called viruspatterns.com, which is a kind of video game where you, it's a video game, but it's also a documentary, and you kind of construct viruses in that way. But again, you're using a visual interface to do it, and you're interacting with some relatively sophisticated maths in the process. And then the other reason I was interested in biology is because I really love philosophy, but I was getting a bit frustrated because there's lots of philosophy that, in my opinion, kind of boils down to biology. So the philosophy of talking about people's feelings, for example, or morals, or well, stuff like that, or thinking. Colours. There's a whole module that was available to me called the philosophy of colour. But the fundamental questions going on in relation to all of those things, in my opinion, are biological. And so I really wanted to understand more about biology, and it seemed to me that biology would also be a good thing to try to apply my visualization skills to.
Would your 10-year-old self have somehow seen what you would be today?
I very much doubt it. I think, okay, when I was 10, I think I was getting quite interested in architecture, but that's just because my grandparents were architects. And my grandma, my grandma said, "Oh, you want to be an architect? Maybe you should draw some buildings." And I said, "Well, that doesn't sound very fun. I want to make I want to draw just completely new ones." And she said, "Well, I don't think you have what it takes to be an architect." So after that, I decided I needed to focus on something else. When I was young, I mostly played video games and watched too much television. I say too much television. I don't want to feel too guilty about it.
There's no such thing as too much television.
Quite right, quite right. But yeah, so I was playing a lot of video games, and in a way, that did set me up. The link to biology and mathematics may seem tenuous, but it is very much there, at least in my case. Video games led to maths.
Now, if you had to explain to your 10-year-old self what geometrical algebra is, how would you do it?
I would get out a load of mirrors, because geometric algebra is fundamentally about things that you can do with mirrors. I'd say to them, okay, so in that video game that you're playing, which was probably Tomb Raider 3, with me being 10 years old, I'd say, all right, actually, coincidentally, Tomb Raider, by the way, was one of the first video games that used geometric algebra, so I certainly didn't know that at the time, so it's unbelievably appropriate that I would be explaining it using Tomb Raider, but anyway. So I'd say, all right, when Lara Croft rotates herself this way and that way, or when she rotates her head upwards to look at the canopy up there, I'd say somebody had to work quite hard to make it so that that would happen in the video game that you're playing right now. Because Lara Croft is made out of triangles. She's made out of lots and lots and lots of triangles. And those triangles have corners. And in order to make her look this way or turn around, you've got to do things with the numbers that tell you where those triangle corners are, such that exactly the right things happens. And it's it can be very difficult, or it can look very difficult if you look at the code. The code might be taking thousands and thousands of these triangle corners and doing lots and lots of calculations with them. But if you want to understand what's going on really, you just need to think about reflections, because a rotation is always some pair of mirror reflections. You reflect in one mirror and then you reflect in the other mirror. And if you've got a way of saying where the mirrors are using numbers, then there's this thing called reflection composition, which means just reflect in this thing and then reflect in that thing, that'll give you something called a quaternion, and that quaternion will be the thing that you then apply to all of those triangle corners that makes Lara Croft move her head or move her body.